So Canada has quietly given up on ever making housing affordable in Canada. This comes from the latest report from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, which is our national housing agency, an extension of our government, and their primary responsibility is to make housing affordable in Canada. And for the longest time, their goal was to ensure that people's housing expenses are not more than roughly about 30% of their gross income. And they have now abandoned that target and have moved the goalposts and have decided that their new definition of affordability is getting prices back to the level they were at in 2019. Now, the problem, of course, is that this is not affordable. If we look back at where Toronto in particular, where home prices were in 2019, home prices in 2019 were roughly about 59% of the average household's income, more than double the 30% that is defined as affordable. So CMHC's new standard is a deeply unaffordable baseline that they are just simply reframing as success. This is CMHC's goal to keep house prices 60% of household income in Toronto. This is not a vision of success. And I think, we need to unpack this absolute failure from a national level to unpack what it means for the next generation and, quite frankly, how we got here. Now, I think one of the biggest problems that we need to think about is the CMHC's biggest failure over the past 5+ years has been this narrow focus on trying to solve our housing crisis by focusing completely on supply, almost ignoring demand entirely. And you can kind of see this in their reports. They repeatedly release supply reports. Now, when Canada's population was booming over the past 15 years, peaking at nearly 1.3 million people per year in 2024, did CMHC publish a single report arguing that this is putting pressure on households, on home prices, on rents? Did they warn Canadians and the government that this growth is so rapid that it is likely going to push home ownership to be permanently pushed out of reach for Canadian households? They didn't. They didn't do that. They just sat and clung to this increasingly implausible solution that if we just build more homes, actually triple the number of homes we build in the short term, then our housing crisis would be solved. But that was obviously completely ludicrous. And that was actually their goal. That was their plan, to triple the number of homes we built over the next 10 years. And of course, now, this belief has collapsed under the weight of their own hubris to think that this is actually feasible. So, CMHC again has focused completely on supply. Over the past 15 years, our home ownership rate in Canada has been declining because more of our houses have been bought by investors, making it harder for young Canadian households to buy them. Has CMHC cautioned about this, that this is driving up home prices, making it less affordable for Canadian households? Of course not, because they don't care. In fact, when Statistics Canada published a report saying that over 100,000 homes in Canada had been converted to permanent short-term rentals, Airbnbs, and I don't mean people renting out their basements. I don't mean people renting out their homes for 2-3 months in a year or vacation homes. These are homes in cities that have been completely converted to permanent short-term rental housing. What was CMHC's response? To downplay it, to say it's not a big problem. We don't need to worry about that. We need to just build more supply. But again, 100,000 homes is not a big deal in their models, but it's certainly a huge factor for the hundreds of thousands of Canadian households that have been shut out of home ownership. Again, this narrow focus from CMHC, assuming that we can just solve all our housing problems by ignoring the demand for housing and simply focusing on supply, is largely how we got here. So where are we? What is the path forward? The path forward is CMHC has effectively admitted that it's almost impossible for people to own their own homes in big cities. So their plan is to convert the next generation into a generation of renters, effectively shut out of home ownership. And you can see this in how they're financing housing. And this chart is from Dan Foch, who was on our show last week, showing CMHC's insured portfolio. So CMHC insures mortgages. They insure mortgages for homeowners who are buying their first home, but they also insure mortgages for the construction of purpose-built rental housing. And now they are actually insuring significantly more debt on purpose-built rental housing than they are for homeowners. And those lines, of course, have been crossed. Homeownership mortgages have been plummeting. The construction and financing for purpose-built rental housing has been surging. So the goal isn't to ever make owning a home more affordable. I mean, they've effectively admitted that's not possible, especially in Canada's largest cities. The goal is to just, get the next generation renting their home. I think that is a massive problem and failure because, again, a lot of households don't want that. Obviously, they want the security of owning their home. And this is why they're moving to other cities and other countries, because homeownership is so unaffordable in cities like Toronto. Now, the last thing I think to keep in mind is, despite the failure of their last report, which is to solve our housing crisis by tripling housing completions, CMHC's sticking to the same plan. They've moved the goalposts, so their definition of affordability is having a deeply unaffordable market, but their solution to get back to 2019 levels of affordability is now to double housing completions. Also, a ludicrous idea. I mean, since they haven't noticed, and since maybe some people haven't noticed, we're in a market where housing starts are trending down. The number of the companies, construction companies laying off people is increasing. We're not in a booming construction period. So we're starting off in an environment where housing starts will be declining. This idea that we can double completions in the short term is, of course, ludicrous. And again, so CMHC has no plan to make homeownership more affordable. They're moving the next generation into rentals. And, when we think about the fact that they have no plan and are hoping we get back to 2019 levels, I mean, it shows you why so many people are still optimistic about real estate in Canada, why so many people are holding on to their properties, refusing to sell. And again, some who are distressed need to, but there are some people still investing, the more shrewd investors, partly because they see Canada has no plan. They have no solutions for this crisis. And again, that doesn't mean we're not going to see some distress in the market. We probably will, especially for small condos. But overall, for owner-occupied housing, for land, I think there's a lot of people who are still bullish because, again, they see long-term, we're going to get through this recession, this slowdown. But for larger housing, there is a path where certainly the demand will exceed the supply. Even though our population growth is going to be negative, that negative is largely driven by a massive decline in non-permanent residents. Immigration is still going to be quite high and probably above what we're building, which means we're still going to have strong demand for larger, probably owner-occupied type housing, 3+ bedroom homes going forward. So again, this isn't a good news story for the next generation who want to own their own home, because Canada has no plan for that. And I think this is one of the challenges when we listen to agencies like CMHC. They're not looking at the full picture. And I think Canadians are paying the price of these flawed policies, I would say, because they're obviously quite flawed. I mean, it was delusional to think that we could triple housing completions, and CMHC assumed we could do this in an environment of falling home prices. This isn't a plan. This is setting your entire plan on a fairy tale, because that's what this abundance supply theory is. It's a fairy tale. We cannot triple housing completions. in an environment of falling home prices. And yet that was CMHC's plan. So not positive news for households. And again, I think we'll have to see how this plays out over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I think we all know we're going to have a very challenging year to 2 years ahead in the housing market, certainly in the condo market and in small condos. We have a lot of units in the pipeline. We have a lot of purpose-built rentals under construction, which are going to compete with small condos. But the market for family-sized housing remains to be seen how it's going to unfold. I'm not as bearish about that segment. Both family-sized rentals and family-sized owner-occupied homes are probably going to do a little bit better. But again, I think the challenge here is there's no real vision or path to affordability in Canada, at least not in our major cities. What do you think our government should be doing? I've highlighted some of the challenges that I'm seeing, but I'm curious to hear what you think. Please post them in the comments below or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.